hello to the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces. Interestingly, at a time when we're all living in private spaces, is a challenge for a man who's been given the job to get us all out about recreating and enjoying this incredible amenity that our city has to offer. So maybe to kick off, Rob, how are you surviving your own private space? How are you surviving homeschooling and all manner of constriction, social isolating?
Yeah, Chris, I think like all of us, I've sort of tried to work as much as possible from home, together with 3 kids who are trying to do school from home, and a wife who's trying to work from home, and a dog who's been pretty annoying. And I think that's an experience common to a lot of people.
It really is, and as we're adapting to it all. Do you think, on the flip side of that, we'll want to get back out to the public spaces, or will we at some stage, you see it inherently changing society, the way we do live, work, play, after, say, 6 months of isolation?
Yeah, no, I do. I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect on the things that really matter, and I think our society will be profoundly affected by this pandemic. Our economy, we're already seeing, is already very severely affected, but I think society itself, the things that we took for granted, are the things that are now under threat, whether it's our families, whether it's our jobs, and even things like public spaces. They're sort of things we've taken for granted, and it's only when our access to these things is limited that we realise how precious they are.
I think a lot of us watched one of your colleagues and friends and mate of ours, Andrew Constance, go through profound personal change from the tragedy of the bushfires that he endured so close up. And he said politics wouldn't be business as usual for him ever again. So we all watched that journey, and it made him probably the most interesting politician in Australia for a while because it was such a social dynamic. And to your point, we're all changing. I know in me, the things I'll do differently. What do you imagine the back end of this you personally do differently? Has it changed politics for you, the way you work, the way you interact with your family?
It's funny you say that, with Easter approaching, it's a time when you reflect on these sorts of things. And I do, it's questioned, I suppose, even the values we attach to material goods. None of those things seem all that important at the moment. And also, relating to people in politics, you do it every day, and sometimes you do it because you love people, but equally it's very frustrating. But because again we don't have the access that we have to people in an ordinary way, you realise the value of relationship. So that's been a profound change for me. It's delightful actually, in one sense, being in the electorate, and we're all sort of walking social distancing through the streets, and you have an opportunity to see people and just wave at a distance. Those sorts of little experiences are really very profound and precious.
All MPs are local members again, that sense of localising experience. Well, maybe just going away from that, some of the broader issues. I said in your portfolio, the now all-powerful reform planning and public spaces portfolio, with the great Jim Betts there, the busiest public servant in the country, the portfolio he has. Maybe we look across Western Sydney as the 2 cities that GSC defines. To that point, you've got a new chairman of the GSC, new chief commissioner, Jeff Roberts, as Lucy steps back. That also allows a time for change. Maybe a combination of the new chairmanship and the population stats we saw come out recently, which suggests that your local electorate isn't going to have as much housing impact as some in southwest Sydney. Do you think all these sort of changes give pause or the right for the government to review things like its transport plan, its rollout of utilities, policing, education, etc.? Does infrastructure allocation need a bit of a review if the population stats are different on which they're originally based?
Well, I think the pandemic's going to be an interesting thing to reflect upon. That was one of those so-called black swan events that always could have happened but never would happen, and of course it has happened, and that will change our infrastructure priorities potentially, although ultimately the planning and implementation go hand in hand, and to a planner a terribly exciting thing, but to most people a very boring thing happened in 2018, which was the first time in history that we've calibrated the regional plan for Sydney, the state infrastructure strategy and the long-term transport master plan, all on the same data sets, all at the same time, all over a similar horizon. And so having done that, we've now got to put the castle in the sky. We've now got to build the foundations underneath them. So it's really implementation at this stage is the key. We've made a lot of commitments in relation to a lot of different pieces of infrastructure, and we've now got to deliver on all of those, whether it's West Metro, whether it's the light rails, whether it's things like the powerhouse. I think sometimes the narrative around the powerhouse has been a bit lost. There are critics in the Eastern Harbour City who say, well, why are we doing that? But they also have to understand that certainly the central river city is being expected to take a huge load of population growth. And the quid pro quo is that we also need to focus all sorts of social, cultural, sporting infrastructure for that growing community. That's the deal.
At the tough end of that, if your local residents of the Northern Beaches and the North Shore are going to have less of the housing burden of growth that, say, the Southwest is going to have, should we be building a new motorway to the Northern Beaches as opposed to upgrading an A6 or A3 into the Southwest? At what stage does that population growth start to impact strongly on the resource allocation?
Yeah, I mean, so it's certainly not my job to speculate on government policy. Government policy is what it is, but I do think in terms of staging and priorities, a bit of a utilitarian lens, greatest good for the greatest number, and we've got to provide the infrastructure where the growth is going to be, and clearly, but the beauty is clearly that's in particularly at this stage the central river city. Over time, it will be also the Western Parkland city. But right now, that focus between sort of the Olympic Park and Parramatta is in Westmead is crucial.
You launched our report last year, seems years ago, only a matter of months ago, stuck in the middle about the central river city. And to that point you've raised there, we've been looking at the governance of the Western City being a great experiment. A chief commissioner for the city, a city deal, the planning partnership of councils, the Western City and Metropolis Authority. Really has been a very successful experiment. It's still a work in progress, but all the reports are. It's worked very well in the Greenfields area. You and I have discussed this before. Since you've come back in this planning space, do you have a view that we could maybe replicate some of those governance measures, the investment attraction, centralisation, is there a GPOP and Central City Authority that might match the success of the Western City and Metropolis Authority?
I think there could be. I think the challenges in the three conceptualised grand cities of Sydney that as defined by the Greater Sydney Commission have different challenges and different trajectories. I think probably the most difficult to plan will actually be the Western Parkland City, because that in one sense is almost intangible. Its scope is so broad, and it's very difficult to know where to begin because it is just such a huge undertaking.
As opposed to the retrofit of the central city. So they're very different challenges. It'll require a different governance model, and also obviously your participation mechanisms have to be different in an area where you don't have neighbours in many parts of the Western Parkland City, and areas densely populated areas of the Eastern City where, of course, every neighbour has a very close interest in what happens next door. So the communities are different, the challenges are different, but we also know that the costs of retrofitting infrastructure can be so incredibly expensive that the lesson from the past couple of 100 years is you map the constraints and you identify where the infrastructure is going to go, how you're going to pay for it before you provide the houses. And that's one of the great lessons. Get it right the first time. People have been bagging Canberra for so long, the Great White Elephant, but it's the original planned city. It's almost the planner's dream. Olympic Park is probably the closest we've had since that to a planned community with infrastructure ahead of population. You have made some governance change around Olympic Park recently, with the department taking back over the scope of the board and some changes there. You're now effectively the Minister for Olympic Park, which is, we know, has not been the great experiment that we'd all have liked from way back Olympic times. Are you confident on your watch now it finally makes it? It finally gets that activation, that amenity that drives it to where we've always originally wanted it to be?
So the big thing with Olympic Park, I think the existing governance had taken it as far as it could. And I think the change in governance was necessary to be able to unlock the opportunities that remain there. And I think, I've picked up a level of frustration in relation to some of the opportunities that haven't been realised at Sydney Olympic Park, and some of the placemaking opportunities in particular. SOPA's done a great job, but I think there's now an opportunity to take that placemaking vision and spread it more widely, to learn, to take some of the lessons from Sydney Olympic Park, to use them elsewhere, but also to, I suppose, under the leadership of Sam Romniuk, who's got incredible experience in public sector for more than 20 years.
He's good.
And also the lessons that have been learned from placemaking in New South Wales, and put that together and join up the thinking so that we can drive forward projects like the stadium, like the redevelopment around the stadium, I can see there's a whole lot of interesting things.
I can see your Northern Beaches influence already. There's going to be a surf park headed for
the wake park
at the moment. So
is very important. Yeah,
it's be nice to get that. All the wax heads, crushing with the Westies. It's going to be an interesting social dynamic.
But see,
Olympic Park's a meeting point.
This is a big part. I mean, the big vision for Sydney is that for too long the opportunities have been in the east and the population's been in the west, and the disconnect has got bigger and bigger and bigger. And Olympic Park, all the way through to Parramatta, that's the meeting point. That's where the opportunities need to be provided to make sure that everyone has access to the same opportunities. To
get that spine, the Parramatta Westmead to Olympic Park spine, and then to drag it from the Hills District to Hurstville, effectively to that central city, which is an unnatural north-south city. It doesn't have the transport links north-south. It doesn't have a cultural connection, but that's one of the challenges in urban planning and urban renewal, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. So getting that right, and that's why it's been identified as one of the strategic-led precincts by the state. Obviously, that's a broader vision. It has a whole series of precincts that need to be planned separately, but we need a broad, unifying vision, which is why it's been identified as one of those strategic precincts.
Just before we finish, Minister, you're like the rest of us. You're at home. You're homeschooling. You're can I ask what's the family's view on Netflix, Amazon Prime? What show has become compulsory viewing in your household?
Yeah, so I'd been doing some homework last night about Fred Hollows, actually, with my 11-year-old, and afterwards I said, well, I think the Madeline was on telly, so I said, well, let's go and watch Madeline. But she wanted to watch Clint Eastwood in Escape from Alcatraz, so.
Movie.
About 11-year-old taste, but it seemed appropriate. So great film, though. But these are the great moments that we get to do that you don't otherwise get to have.
And otherwise, some of your announcements recent days about extended hours for construction sites, the viability. Two things. One, I hope also we consider those white collar factories. The planners are just as important as the people in high vis. We've got to get the great planning agencies and architects working on procuring the next range of projects, as well as get the tradies on site. But I hear you're the new pin-up boy in all the construction sites. There's Rob Stokes' calendar's going up because they all love you. You've let them get on with the job.
Well, and Chris, I mean, thanks for that. But there's a message in that as well, that we need all these building sites to be responsible with, what's the line from Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. There's an enormous freedom to now operate on extended hours, but with that, we really need to be mindful of the surrounding communities, because ultimately, if there's, if people are using that opportunity unwisely or irresponsibly, it'll be taken away. We've all got to muck in and work this out together. And as you say, and this is the great lesson that I've learned from the leadership dialogue more broadly, is getting people together to talk these issues through ultimately saves a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of conflict further down the line. And as you say, getting all those white-collar factories, the planners, the architects, the thinkers, to get through this huge number of applications that are in the system currently, that'll provide, at the moment we're all dealing with response to coronavirus, that will have to turn to recovery at some point, and the recovery planning will have a huge part to play in that. And so it's time for us all to step up, to work harder than we've ever worked before, to look after those people who are currently losing their jobs, to make sure that they have an opportunity when the weather warms up and when we can get back to normal.
I'm going to pass over in a moment to my friend Guy Templeton from WSP, who's hosting our gig today, who'll be very excited by your understanding of the white collar factories report as well. But can I say in closing, First Minister, you've already been through significant change. That's the first time I've heard you quote Spider-Man instead of a German philosopher in recent times. So there's
it's Netflix.
Change is coming to all of us. Thank you very much, Minister. Good luck. Godspeed. Stay safe.
You too. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Rob. Bye-bye.
Guy Templeton, Chief Executive of WSP in Australia and New Zealand. Thank you so much to the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue and its Chief Executive Chris Brown for organising Minister Stokes to spend some time sharing his views on the development of Western Sydney. The Minister's views around a strategic approach to place really resonated with me. That well-organised approach to how we develop further amenity. And it's very much in keeping with the master planning work that we've done around the Westmead precinct and also the Sydney Olympic Park precinct, that you've got to get the infrastructure in place before you start building the houses, as the Minister said. He also made points around the importance of infrastructure, not just during the COVID crisis, but as we rebound from that, to underpin the longer term economic growth of the Western Sydney region. So again, thank you very much, Minister, for spending time with us today. Your insights are valuable and we do appreciate your time. Thank you.